Something interesting has quietly been brewing in the Russia-Ukraine war. Well, I suppose the explosions associated with this have been quite loud, but the thing in question has mostly escaped media attention, likely because there have been a lot of other things going on in the world lately. Anyway, the target is Russian oil, but more subtly, a possible new Ukrainian game plan for 2024, and more strangely, a bizarre way for Kyiv to get better leverage in Washington and in Brussels. What specifically is on tap for today? Well, we will talk about what exactly Ukraine has been up to regarding Russian oil, its apparent newfound ability to project power, how this changes the landscape of the war, and if you are wondering, yes, landscapes do imply some lines on maps, the asymmetry in the preferences that Ukraine and the rest of the Western coalition have, and how Ukraine's new strategy might help break the legislative gridlock in both the United States and the European Union. But we start with the facts of what is happening with Ukraine's new attacks. Much has been made of the relatively frozen front lines on the ground. On one side, you have Ukraine's 2023 counteroffensive mostly drawing a blank. Meanwhile, Russia currently has the initiative, but has been similarly slow to make any real progress. Juxtaposed with the frozen ground is the movement everywhere else. The news has been almost all positive for Ukraine at sea, a point that we will return to later. And now there is something in the air. And no, it is not love. It is war. We are going to need a wide map for this one. On January 9th, it was a set of drones targeting a fuel and energy complex north of Kharkiv. On January 18th, it was a drone targeting an oil terminal near St. Petersburg that was shot down, but still exploded on impact. On January 19th, 4 oil tanks lit up just north of the border with Ukraine. The same day, a fire raged in an oil refinery southeast of Moscow. 2 days later, a sprawling fuel export terminal outside of St. Petersburg ground to a halt. On January 26th, it was an oil refinery along the Black Sea. The next day, it was Russia's 4th largest refinery, well east of Moscow. On January 29th, there was an attempt on another refinery further northwest, though Russian air defenses stopped that one. On January 31st, it was back to St. Petersburg, this time an oil refinery. And on February 3rd, it was a refinery to the east. Apologies that took so long to go through, but I think it is important to appreciate the scale of what is happening here. Indeed, as the attacks accumulate, it is clear that Ukraine is now making a play on the Russian economy by striking at the metaphorical black gold. But perhaps what is most remarkable is the distance. The furthest target is about 872 kilometers from Kharkiv, also known as 542 freedom units. However you want to measure it, that is a ton of distance that Russian air defenses were not exactly doing what the Kremlin would want them to do. Put bluntly, it is apparent that Ukraine can project power, and that has important implications for the war. As a starting point, it is a frightening prospect for Russia. The overall goal for Russia here is to capture Ukrainian territory at a cost-effective rate. And as the bigger country, Russia wants to leverage its resource and manpower advantages. Bigger is better in that regard. But the problem with being bigger is that, well, you are bigger. Russia has plenty of valuable things spread out over 17 million square kilometers. If those valuable things were to get blown up, suddenly that cost-effective rate condition from a second ago comes into question. As long as Ukraine is stuck playing the game on its home turf, the Kremlin has nothing to worry about. But now, through the power of drones, Ukraine can project power. All planners in Kyiv need to do is find 1 square kilometer at a time of vulnerable Russian territory to strike. And, at least for the time being, it appears that Russian air defenses are not up to the task. Let's put this in the context of the attritional phase that the war is currently in. There are 2 models of wars of attrition. the version where states keep fighting until one has run out of soldiers or materiel, and the version where both sides continue to accumulate costs until one gives up. The attrition labeling tends to make the first definition the more commonly recognized version, but it is also the rarer one in practice. Regarding the current war, any casualty is a tragic loss of life, and even conservative estimates are beginning to reach frightening levels. Both sides are therefore having to weigh strategies to bring new soldiers into the fold. But we are far from the point where a complete breakdown in military capacity is on the table. This is not close to World War I, at least not yet anyway. Ukraine, which is ostensibly the weaker link in a purely attritional battle by virtue of having a smaller population, still has not mobilized men under the age of 25. Part of this is because of Ukraine's demographics, with a narrowing of people in their 20s. If you are familiar with Russia's demographics, it is like that, but somehow worse. Another connected part is Kyiv's desire to preserve a long-term economic future. But the point is that there is still plenty of capacity, even on the Ukrainian side. Instead, keeping the war going is a question of political will. Side note here. Political will would not be a bad secondary name for this channel. Anyway, luckily for us, political will is the second version of a war of attrition. Both sides pay costs to stay in the game until one chooses to pull out. Let's visualize the situation with some lines on maps, though this is going to be a little different from usual. The white line is roughly where the military status quo is. Let's imagine that it is indeed frozen, so that there is no doubt what will happen to it in the future, given the military balance. If you do not think that that is the case, good news, you can watch this video instead. For those of you still here, by staying in the game, each side can keep the line there and prevent the other side from choosing a different division. The problem with a war of attrition, though, is that it is costly to participate. Let me shrink that existing line to something a little more manageable. Okay, now imagine that every day that Ukraine participates, it loses resources equivalent to the per-day value of the territory between the yellow and blue lines. Likewise, Russia loses an equivalent to the space between the blue and red lines. Bigger distance, greater costs. Smaller distance, smaller costs. One of the central problems that Ukraine has faced in this war is that the battles are occurring in Ukraine, meaning that Ukraine is bearing the brunt of the damage. And to top it off, Russia has been using its ability to project power to specifically target Ukrainian infrastructure, aside from whatever is going on near the front lines. Hence, you get images like these. Consequently, as a default, Ukraine's cost burden has been enormous. The only saving grace for Ukraine here is that loss of life and treasure is measured relative to how much you value the stakes at hand. Ukraine, fighting over Ukrainian territory and the existence of its national identity, weighs that highly, which pushes back how much it is internalizing the actual damage. Over the last year, Ukraine has also beaten back Russian ships on the Black Sea. This has allowed Ukraine to begin exporting grain at near the pre-war levels, and in fact is now exporting more than was the case under the Black Sea Grain Initiative, though the Red Sea crisis is wreaking havoc on that. But then again, where isn't it? Anyway, the point here is that year over year, Ukraine's costs have declined by a significant margin. However, a central problem that Ukraine has faced in this war is the lack of the power to hurt Russia. Moscow is not in ruins, and while Russia has been taking significant casualties, that, as of yet, has not much bothered the Kremlin. It is one of the joys of uncompetitive elections. As a result, there was a significant cost imbalance between the two states. However, Ukraine's oil offensive is an attempt to reduce the discrepancy. Indeed, recall the old joke that Russia, at some level, is an oil and gas company masquerading as a state. That being the case, the real way to hurt Russia is to go after its energy revenues. It represents a notable improvement on the lines from Ukraine's perspective, though perhaps it does not go as far as policymakers in Kyiv wish it would. Arguably, the more interesting aspect of the offensive is how it will play out in Washington and Brussels. Yes, Ukraine, the United States, and the European Union, among others, are coalition partners. But like any other friendly partnership, their preferences are not fully aligned. This may be most apparent in their perspectives on Russian energy exports. The goal in the West has not been to prevent Russia from selling any oil. Rather, it has been to reduce Russia's windfall profits as much as possible, to reduce the total revenues that the Kremlin brings in. It is a best-of-both-worlds strategy: constrain Russia's military budget, but also keep the spigots running to maintain low oil prices globally. To some extent, Ukraine cares about this too. If inflation runs rampant, many of Kyiv's partners are going to begin withdrawing, due to their domestic audiences getting fed up with higher prices. Meanwhile, Ukraine has assisted Russia, to varying degrees, during the war with gas transit, via a pipeline running through Ukrainian territory. The logic being that Ukraine is charging a transit fee, which it can then turn around and use for arms to fuel the war. But the point here is that Ukraine is more worried about winning than any of its coalition partners are. It is Ukrainian territory after all. As such, risking globally higher energy prices by engaging in these bombing runs is of little concern to Kyiv. But this gives Ukraine newfound leverage in trying to secure aid from Washington and Brussels. It may not be a coincidence that we started seeing the attacks just as gridlock threatened assistance from the United States and the European Union. Ukraine has little bargaining leverage in its aid requests to the West, other than volunteering Ukrainian blood to keep Russia from advancing westward, which seems like a disproportionately large sacrifice, but such is the world of international politics. Attacking oil facilities may be the answer. If the line is frozen because aid is not flowing, then the cost game may be what Ukraine is forced to play. The West may not like that due to what it does to the markets. But if aid is not going to be coming anyway, then Western countries hardly have a veto. But now Ukraine has something to offer. If Western weapons come in sufficient quantities, then Ukraine may no longer feel the need to target Russian oil infrastructure. Besides, there are plenty of military targets that Ukraine can aim its drones at instead. In terms of the actual arm twisting, in Europe, that means the non-Hungary countries working harder to force Hungary to accept aid packages, given the dance that Orban likes to do. And this did finally come to fruition at the beginning of February. We will have to see if this changes any of the attack priorities. Of course, Europe is only half of the story. In the United States, Ukraine's leverage means that Democrats become more willing to compromise on things like border security, while Republicans become less demanding about concessions on that same topic, so that Mike Johnson passes something through the House that will not immediately die in the Senate or at the president's desk. To be clear, insofar as if Ukraine is actively trying to leverage this, it will be unlikely that we would see it being discussed in public. Internal battles like this are not exactly the types of things you want everyone to see. Anyway, here is something that Speaker Johnson, even if he was doing his best impression of LeBron James, could not block. Me telling you about some awesome books about the Russia-Ukraine war. Check the video description for more information on them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And I will see you next time. Take care.